For more on where the president's current stance places him currently and historically, let's call in Nixon White House counsel John Dean, author of the books Worse Than Watergate, The Secret Presidency of George W. Bush, and, of course, Conservatives Without Conscience. John, good evening.
Good evening, Keith.
Let me start with this overall assessment. Between that opinion number, 27% approval on handling Iraq, to the speech by the Republican Senator Smith from Oregon, is this presidential administration in peril, not from impeachment necessarily, but from some sort of internal revolution within the Republican ranks?
Well, Bush did a wonderful job of dragging them down in the election that I'm sure they have not forgotten. Keith, a president rules most powerfully with his bully pulpit. This president has never been very good at that. He's obviously got new plans in the works. He's going to have to go out and sell them. I'm told he's pretty good one-on-one. He may well be able to keep his party people in line. But if he doesn't have something new to say to them, something that they believe and can buy into, and then they can in turn go out and sell it at home, he is in trouble. So we'll have to wait and see what his review comes up with. But I think he's got to realize, given the aftermath of the election, he's in trouble.
But so far he hasn't realized it. There hasn't been anything new. And about Iraq, do we attribute that kind of ostrich-like stance from the president and what we heard from the defense secretary in his kind of parting shot today? Does this all tie into that prescient remark that you made before the election that even if the Republicans lost both the House and the Senate, Karl Rove and the others in the White House would view that setback as nothing more than a temporary phase? Could they still be believing this is a temporary phase politically?
I suspect they do. If you look at what kind of president Bush is, and I did this actually back in 2004, in April of 2004, and then again in May of 2006, drawing on the very classic analysis by James David Barber, who puts presidents into various schools and categories, and he said this president would fit on his criteria into an active negative. Those are people like Woodrow Wilson, Hoover, Lyndon Johnson, and Richard Nixon. They're people who ride their policies right down to defeat until the very end, and their presidents don't do very well. So I think it's going to be very surprising if this president does change, and that's why I think he's in a lot of trouble if he doesn't.
Having dealt with cynical and disastrous presidencies up close, does it look to you like this one, this president having politicized his way into Iraq, might now be going to try to hold back getting out of Iraq until it can be used to his party's benefit in the 2008 campaign, or is that too cynical even for this administration?
Well, that's a fair question, Keith, because I did work for a president who did want to take every advantage, and I think Nixon was unable to pass the torch because he had to leave before then. I think this president is very definitely going to try to do something where the administration that follows him will not do to him what he has done to Clinton, and that is to blame everything on them, because there's a lot of blame to be pushed around in this instance. So if he can pass the torch and help the Republican Party get somebody in there in 2008, he's certainly going to do that. So that'll be a part of his calculation. He's a very political president.
I still retain a negative fondness for James Buchanan, but we have talked about this White House being the textbook case of authoritarianism before. Since the last time we discussed this, the war in Iraq has unbelievably gone to even much worse from the original bad. If in face of the overwhelming evidence that the plan in Iraq is not working, the public disapproval at this extraordinary high, if even now President Bush is not willing to change course on a real basis, and Mr. Rumsfeld's not expressing any remorse, might that be the deciding historical factor in declaring once and for all this president the worst one ever?
Well, the worst president ever is a great parlor game. I happen to enjoy playing it, as a lot of other people do. The interesting part of the game is there's no criteria. I've often thought if the criteria were how long does it take us after a president who makes mistakes to bail ourselves out and extricate ourselves from the problems he creates, and we judge them on that basis, well, then this president, could be leaving a legacy that's going to take us a long time to bail out. It would put him right down there with Richard Nixon, who we're still bailing out from.
John Dean, author of Worse Than Watergate and Conservatives Without Conscience. As always, John, great thanks for being with us.